was an interesting experience, and a lot of people ask me, was there an order to that? So in other words, was I a scientist who became a priest or not? And I think this is why it's so strong inside of me. I constantly went back and forth. And so in high school, it was clear to me that I wanted to be a priest by my junior year in high school. And also, I love science. And one of the reasons why I picked the Oblates of St. Francis de Sales to join is that we had a lot of teaching opportunities. And so I went off and started in a seminary, in college, majoring in biology. I had to get a minor in philosophy as well, and an instructional certification to teach. Then after that, I went off for a master's degree in cell biology. Then I went for a Master of Divinity degree. So you could say it was science, and then I went back over to the pastoral area. And then I taught for 3 years, and then I went back and did the Ph.D. So going back and forth like that was a good way for me to be able to kind of keep synthesizing it as it went. I knew right from the beginning that I wanted to be a scientist. I always loved science. I remember in grade school, I was always the one who did the experiments for the class. So sister would always say to us, you know, hey Peter, would you set this up and put the stuff in the test tubes and do all that? And so when I was in 4th or 5th grade, I just loved science. But I also loved religion too, and because of that, I was very heavily involved in the parish that I grew up in. In fact, I became one of their organists because I have a music background too, and so it wasn't unusual for me to be late in the lab and then the next morning going off to Mass and being the organist for everybody to sing. And so that's been a life journey for me that's been very fulfilling. Because I really don't see personal conflicts with anything between those two areas. I keep them appropriately in their boxes, but not separate them so much that they can't talk to each other. So use science to do the things of science, use religion to do the things of religion, and then become a better person, I think, because you understand both of those worlds. Oh, there are pretty few scientist priests. In fact, this is old data, but it goes back about 20 or 30 years now, what they call CARA, which is the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate. It's now at Georgetown University. And they came looking for me because they said I was one of 64 Ph.D. biology priests in the country. So there's one in every state kind of thing, so it's not very frequent that it happens here. Why does that happen? I would think 2 reasons. The first is that most priests go into the ministry because they want to do a parish or something like that, and so their number one thought isn't necessarily to go into science at the same time. But at the same time, if you consider that that becoming a scientist, like I have a PhD in molecular biology, so I have 2 master's degrees, one in cellular biology and the other one's in MDiv, they call it, and then I have a PhD in molecular biology. That's a long road to hoe. So if you're going to do that in the seminary at the same time, I think for most people they'd have a hard time wanting to take that on as a project. But I'll give you a funny piece of trivia, which is that there are actually 2 PhD biology priests in this state. And the other one is an oblate of St. Francis de Sales as well as I am. And so he's in Durham, North Carolina. So we're both here doing pastoral ministry, but our background is PhDs in molecular biology. If you look at the trends that are happening in the United States, there's a real shortage in priests. And one of the questions they asked me in that previous study from CARA was, is there a value for someone to be a priest and a biologist? And my answer was yes, because I think you need people who can cross the line. So if you want to talk about issues of genetic engineering, then I would understand how they work. If you want to talk about medical ethics in particular areas that involve, the genome, for example, then I would be familiar with that too. So I said I think they should always be the minority, but they're a real good resource to have priests who are scientists out there. And so I would suggest that the trend data would say it's going down just because there's such a shortage of priests, and the number of priests is going down total in the United States as well. So those two would have a lot to do with that. Again, you're back to that first question, which is how many people would want to go and get a PhD? So I did 2 years for a master's and 4 more years for a PhD with all the things that deal with publishing and the associated things with the degree. And so I would think not too many people want to jump in that and also into the professional development that you need in order to be a priest at the same time. I mean, the challenges you will experience as a scientist priest have to do with dealing with people who aren't very religious. I find, and in my lab that I worked in when I was doing my PhD, one of my professors used to say to me, being a scientist either makes you a better religious person or a non-religious person. It's almost like there's a divider there. And so when you're trying to face issues with people that are scientists, then that's where you're going to have the rub. For me personally, I think the two of them fit together seamlessly. And that's been my life's work, is being able to constantly ask myself the question. I remember back when I was in high school, wondering about how evolution might fit in with being in the seminary, and that took me a couple years to resolve that. But I now realize that the hand of God works through evolution in a special way. Religion can answer the questions, the big questions to me of why are we here, etc., which science can't even touch. And science can touch the questions like, how does this work? And they're both interesting questions, but they're very different questions and they need different resources in order to answer them. There are scientists that I'm friends with who are atheists, and I know when we talk to them that they basically come up with the position that they want to take science and apply it to the Bible, and that doesn't work very well. Scientific proofs for different things, you may have some. It's kind of neat when you see an excavation takes place and you realize that scientifically there's something that's really valid there. They've even done carbon dating on what are supposed to be the bones of St. Peter and St. Paul, and they both date to the right period, so that adds that these people are real and that these remains are actually, that have been venerated for centuries, are the real thing. But it's not conclusive proof, it just means they were around in the same period. And so if you want to apply science to support your faith, I think you're going to find that there's not enough there to do it, because it's trying to answer a different question, which is how does it work? Why am I here? What's the meaning of morality? What is happiness? Those are all questions I think you have to answer in other realms other than science directly. Even a psychologist, I know a psychologist who does a thing on happiness, and I keep saying to him, you need to get this right, but you're really not measuring happiness, you are measuring people's perception of happiness. So if I say on a 10-point scale, how happy are you today? You can give me a number, but I'm not sure that's objective in a scientific way. And other people might say, well, we can measure your endorphins, the hormones that are in your brain that cause happiness, for example. And you can do that, but now you're just measuring endorphins. You're not necessarily measuring what really becomes the manifestation of happiness. And so those are very different things. And for myself, I've had a wonderful life trying to fit those things together and see how they talk to each other and where the areas are that they relate. When I was a university professor, for years I taught a seminar on God and science, and they would put the 14 brightest sophomores in the class in the honors program into this one seminar. And what I would do is give them a number of essays that were written by scientists about God, and then ask them to think about them. And in some cases they were saying, you know, this is an awful essay, and I would say that's true. So here's a scientist who hasn't been able to figure out how to connect them, trying to write about the subject. And other people, you would read them and you're like, yeah, there you go, you got the right idea there. So that interface is an interesting place to be. I think, just like the previous question, that science does something different. It answers how does it work, and religion can answer the question, why are we here, the why questions as I call them. I think the biggest misunderstanding has been when scientists try to make it a matter of faith that their science is going to be a certain way, and when the church tries to make it a matter of faith that the science is right or wrong. They're really not in the best positions to criticize each other because they take their stuff from two different wells, as it were, and so when they put that bucket down in the well, it's a very philosophical bucket that religion begins in, and then it's also a very Cartesian kind of bucket. That's Descartes, where it's stuff I can measure, stuff I can see. That's what you're really working with in science, and the things of religion are very different. So if you actually go back and look at the age of Galileo, Galileo got censored. People say, well, there it is, the church is trying to meddle in science. And the reality is that Galileo really thought it was a matter of faith that the cosmos worked the way it did. And so he was taking science and trying to force it on religion, and religion reacted by basically censuring him. There is a personal story that I have about this, which is St. Francis de Sales, who is the patron of the Oblates of St. Francis de Sales. He was around during the period of Galileo, and one of the students that followed in physics after Galileo was John Anthony Berenzano. And he started getting in trouble with the same kind of thing, trying to use science to tell religion what to do. And St. Francis de Sales actually sat him down and said, you need to think about this. Science is good as science, and religion is good as religion. And they draw their stuff from different areas, so you don't want to force scientific conclusions on religion, and religion should avoid making scientific conclusions on science. And so because of that, he never gets censured. So it was a neat thing. And there's a lesson in that for all of us, because a couple hundred years go by, and the next thing you know, we're thinking that Copernicus thought that the Earth went around the sun, and then he gets censured. That he was right scientifically. He was absolutely right scientifically, and the church has apologized to him. But on the other side, you can't take your tools of science, I think, and force them onto religious issues of morality. As for example, there's no equipment in science to deal with morality, and that's to me why it's so essential that the two of them connect together. Because if you would like to be a moral scientist, then you need to put one foot into the philosophical, ethical, religious world where all of the ethics comes from, and keep your other foot in the scientific world and put them together. So you see right now, stem cells, for example, embryonic stem cells. Science has zero equipment to make a pronouncement on whether or not that's moral. On the other hand, religion doesn't have the equipment to figure out cell differentiation. And those two things are critical to that issue. And so for years, I was always saying that embryonic stem cells to me are immoral because we conceive an individual and we interrupt that individual's life in order to harvest them. But on the other hand, there's these things called adult stem cells that I would be very familiar with. You can get them out of your nose, believe it or not. And you can take those cells out, and my analogy is this. If you start with an embryonic stem cell, it's like a tree. And it has to build its own trunk and its branches and its leaves, and each branch has a different shape and it's very complicated. If you use an adult stem cell, you're taking a branch off a tree and trying to get to the leaf, and so it's a much simpler kind of thing. And when I say that, people were like, well, that makes a lot more sense than what I've been hearing from the scientists, but that's because I am a scientist that would understand stem cells, and at the same time, I understand the morality of things, and and right now, it's adult stem cells that are doing much more in science than the embryonic stem cells ever did.